All right, so we're going to move right into the chattel slavery portion here. Okay, so we've already talked about Irish indentured servitude, how that's defined, what it means, what happened a little bit there. Again, I noticed the information that I provided, while brief, does provide an overview. Like I said, again, I'm going to be providing links and sources to everything that I've pulled up here. So I'm not going to leave any sources out. Now, getting into chattel slavery here, so I'm going to get right into defining that. And chattel slavery is defined as an enslaved person who is owned as property, okay, for their entire natural life, and whose children and children's children are automatically enslaved, okay? And this is going back to talking about how chattel slavery is hereditary, okay? Now, part of the roots of chattel slavery came during the late 17th century and around the time when Virginia passed its first slave codes, okay, or set of slave laws, okay? And effectively, the 17th century saw the complete end of African indentured servitude. Okay, and that was due to the passing of these slave codes. Okay, now an excerpt from one of these slave laws in Virginia reads as, all servants brought into the country, imported, okay, into the colonies, who were not Christian in their native country, okay, shall be accounted or categorized and be made slaves. All Negro, mulatto, and Indian, Native American, slaves who fit into that dominion shall be held and be made real estate. Okay, now again, with the word real estate here, we're not even allowing these slaves to identify as human beings, something that was never taken away from the indentured servant. They were never not allowed to call themselves human. They were never not allowed to count as human. They were never not counted by the people who owned their contracts as human. Okay? Now, getting into the code a little bit further, it goes on with the relationship between the slave and the slave master. Okay? And it goes on to state that if any slave shall resist his master in being corrected, so after having been reprimanded for something or being told to do something, and if in the process of correcting the slave master happens to kill that slave, the master shall be free of any and all punishment, as if such accident never happened. Now, ain't that a bitch? You find me a law, find me a code, find me any damn thing where it's documented that the indentured servants had such laws and codes passed against them to this degree. I haven't been able to find any. Believe me, I have looked. Okay? I've looked. Now, before the enacting of these slave codes, okay, around 1705 here, people who were considered slaves, okay, so, if you had someone of European descent who was considered a slave, if you had someone of African descent before then who was considered a slave, or of any descent, doesn't matter who they were, if they had a beef with their slave master, they could take these beefs before a court. They could have these disputes heard by someone in a position of authority above their master, and hopefully get some resolution on this dispute. Okay? You actually had somebody who was going to listen to you. After that code was passed, after these slave codes were passed, that shit was 86'd. Okay? So if you had a dispute after that, you kept your fucking mouth closed. Because if you opened your mouth to your slave master, and in a majority of these cases, you got your ass beat repeatedly or killed. But there was no court hearing your beef. There was none of that going on. Now, it was around this point here, again, when the slave codes were passed, that these extremely, and a majority of them were, extremely vindictive and just cruel ass slave masters. Now, who had, difficult slaves, ones who were a little bit harder to manage, they wanted to break these cats in. And what they could do now is, now that these codes were passed, where they're free of being reprimanded, they could beat the living shit out of their slaves. Okay? And I mean beat the living shit out of them. Kill them if they had to. Because they didn't have to fear being taken to jail or having any kind of penalty for doing so. It was open season. They didn't have to worry about what the hell happened after that. What did they care? So now, continuing with this punishment thread, there were a number of penalties that were passed down for breaking laws as a slave, where you could be whipped, branded, maimed, and all three of those punishments there, you could have all three of those done for breaking a slave law. For example, like associating with a European. And associating could be any damn thing, from talking to them, shaking hands with them, being in their presence without permission, any of that. You could have any one of those three things happen to you because of that shit. And there's account after account in the slave narratives, the autobiographies that were written by those individuals, those slaves, okay, which tells you about these things. And in specific, one example in the slave narratives that are in there is a slave who was seen to have his arms and legs spread out, roped on the ground, okay, so the ropes were nailed into the ground. And this slave master set his back on fire and just watched his back burn. It didn't say what the crime was for, but he set the man's back on fire and just watched him suffer. That's the kind of shit I'm talking about. But again, where is the documentation? Where are the historical accounts? Why was no one writing this down if this so-called happened to the Irish slaves or indentured servants? Where's the documentation? Now, to go back and touch on one of the claims that John Dunnigan made in his post, which was that the reproducing of slaves was not economical, and that it cut into the profits of the slave masters. Okay? Every other source that I have checked, literally every other source that I have checked, including the autobiographies of the slaves themselves who wrote their own stories, has clearly stated numerous times that the slaves were encouraged and in some cases forced to reproduce for the very reason of profiting the slave master. Because the slave master was increasing their stock, because once these children were old enough to work, they were put to work either on that plantation where they were born, or they were sold to someone else. But the slave master profited from this. It did not cut into profits, as this man is saying. If you knew how little they actually spent on clothing, and again, I'm going to give you the reference, the link to this book, and you can find out for yourself how much they spent in there, because it differs from slave story to slave story, because they were on different plantations. But if you knew how little they spent on these things, you wouldn't even say things like that. He wouldn't even say shit like that if he actually read this book. But I know he didn't. John, check your sources. I don't even want to call you a source, because your shit's it's ridiculous, man. It's not even credible. But anyway, I digress. So getting back to the foundation of what makes an indentured servant and what makes a chattel slave here. So obviously with the indentured servant I talked about earlier, you have that contract that's being sold from person to person, okay? And again, you have that finite, defined period of time from anywhere from 3 to 7 years, and and such for these contracts for an indentured servant. Okay, but it had a beginning and an end. With slavery, with chattel slavery, you didn't have any contract being exchanged between slave masters. Okay, in some cases you had a bill of sale. Okay, like you're buying some jeans or a fucking t-shirt. Okay, you got a receipt for some shit that you bought. But that's it. That's all you got. You didn't get any contract for chattel slaves. Nothing. Okay? Indentured servants did not have to worry at the beginning of every year of having their family torn apart, to have to go to the fucking auction block with children who may have been too young to be sold at the time, but to watch their husband or their wife or their children who were old enough to work being sold to someone else. You had family after family being ripped a fucking part, man, at the auction block. Men and women who were forced to watch their children shipped away, and in a majority of these cases, never seen again. There is documentation of this shit. Documentation of this. Where's the documentation for these so-called 100,000 Irish Catholic children who were ripped from their mothers and fathers and sold into slavery? Where's the proof? Now, to go further into what I was talking about before with the fact that chattel slavery is hereditary, you had a little clause called a child shall follow the condition of the mother. Okay? And again, this was something else which was documented in Virginia shortly after Massachusetts, which again became one of the colonies to enact these laws early on. Okay? Now, throughout many places in Europe, in England and things like that, when it came to slavery and children in specific, any children that were born to a slave woman followed the condition of the father. Meaning, if the father was a slave, the children were enslaved. If the father was a free man, the children were born free. The United States decided to take a little bit different turn with that. And they said, to hell with that. We're going to make this so that the children follow the condition of the mother instead. Okay? And in one of these laws, in pertaining to Negro mulatto women, okay, there is a law that states that Negro women's children were to serve according to the condition of the mother. It goes on to state that whereas some doubts have arisen whether children got by an Englishman, okay, so a European, upon a Negro woman should be free or slave, be it therefore enacted and declared by this present Grand Assembly, okay, so the Assembly of Virginia, who passes these laws and these codes, that all children born in this country shall be held bond or free only according to the condition of the mother, and that if any Christian shall commit fornication with a Negro man or woman, he or she so offending shall pay double fines imposed in the former act. And there are many other reports of acts and codes and laws like this, which would tell you that if, you're a Christian European who is caught fraternizing and sleeping with slaves, with Africans, your ass ended up in big trouble. But the slave got it worse. The slave got it worse.